Will you be my wife for the next 5 minutes? Elizabeth Delacroix nearly choked on the salmon canapé she had just put in her mouth. Her honey-brown eyes widened as they met the piercing gaze of a tall man with perfectly styled dark hair and a suit that cost more than 3 months of her rent. "Excuse me, what?" she whispered, trying to swallow discreetly while looking for an escape route in the crowded ballroom of the Meridian Hotel. This night was supposed to be simple. Work as a waitress at New York's most exclusive charity event, serve champagne to bored millionaires, go home with some tips, and continue her mediocre life as usual. It definitely wasn't in the plans to be approached by the most devastatingly handsome man she'd ever seen in her life. 5 minutes, he repeated, lowering his voice and moving dangerously closer. "I need you to be my wife for just 5 minutes. In return, I'll pay you $10,000. Elizabeth blinked several times, thinking she had heard wrong. $10,000? That amount would cover her debts and still leave enough for her to finally move out of the tiny studio apartment she lived in. "Are you insane?" she stammered, looking around nervously. "I can't. I'm working, and besides, I don't even know you." "William Blackstone." He introduced himself with a smile that could melt glaciers. "Will to friends. And you are—" "Someone who shouldn't be talking to the guests," she replied, trying to back away but bumping into the dessert table behind her. A tray of petit fours wobbled dangerously. "Careful." Will gently caught her arm, steadying her. The touch sent an electric current through her entire body. "Look, I know this sounds crazy, but it's an emergency. My grandmother is coming over here right now, and if she finds out I'm still not married—" "What, she'll disinherit you?" Elizabeth laughed sarcastically. "What a tragedy for someone who clearly has enough money to buy a 5-minute wife. Worse, she'll force me to marry Priscilla Worthington Ashford." Elizabeth glanced to the side and saw an elegant blonde in a baby pink dress approaching, with a smile that looked more like a threat. The situation began to make more sense. "Please," Will pleaded, and for the first time she saw vulnerability in his blue-gray eyes. "I just need her to believe I found someone. After that, you go back to your normal life and I go back to mine." Elizabeth bit her lower lip. $10,000. It was more money than she had ever seen together in her entire life. And for just 5 minutes of acting. "Will, darling." An authoritative voice cut through the air. An elegant lady with silver hair and imperial posture was approaching, followed by the aforementioned Priscilla. "Where were you? Priscilla has been looking for you everywhere." "Grandma Eleanor." Will smiled tensely. "Good to see you. I was just—" "Introducing his fiancée to us," Elizabeth interrupted, surprising herself. The word came out before she could think better of it. Will looked at her with simultaneous gratitude and panic. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor Blackstone examined Elizabeth from head to toe with eagle eyes. Priscilla looked like she had swallowed a whole lemon. "Your fiancé?" Eleanor repeated slowly. "Yes, that's right," Elizabeth stammered, feeling cold sweat running down her forehead. "Surprise." "Surprise indeed," Priscilla murmured venomously. "And when exactly did you two meet?" Elizabeth looked at Will in panic. They hadn't planned any story. "It was romantic," Will improvised quickly. "Love at first sight, wasn't it, darling?" "Very romantic," she confirmed, forcing a smile. "So romantic that—" "I'm still in shock." That wasn't even a lie. "And what's your name, my dear?" Eleanor asked with a tone that suggested the answer would determine whether Elizabeth would leave there alive. "Elizabeth," she replied, trying to sound confident. "Elizabeth. Delacroix." "Delacroix," Eleanor repeated, savoring the name. "French?" Descendant." Elizabeth lied shamelessly. Actually, the surname had been her father's invention, who thought it sounded sophisticated. The family's real name was Johnson. "Interesting," Eleanor murmured. "And what do you do for a living, dear?" Elizabeth felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. What the hell could she say? That she was a temporary waitress who lived in a studio apartment and whose biggest luxury was a bag of popcorn at the movies. Will started to speak, but Eleanor interrupted him with a gesture. Let her answer herself, William. All eyes turned to Elizabeth. Priscilla was smiling maliciously, clearly waiting for her to hang herself with her own words. Eleanor maintained a neutral but intimidating expression, and Will looked at her with a mixture of hope and terror. I work in hospitality, she said finally, technically not lying. How wonderful! Eleanor seemed genuinely interested. At which establishment? Elizabeth felt her throat go dry. She was officially cornered. Various, she improvised. I'm a freelance consultant. I help organize special events. Again, it wasn't exactly a lie. She really did help organize events by serving drinks to guests. What a fascinating coincidence, Priscilla interrupted with false sweetness. I've been organizing charity events for years and I've never heard of you. In which circle do you work? Elizabeth felt her palms sweating. She was about to be unmasked when, Darling, a shrill female voice echoed through the ballroom. Elizabeth, you're here! Everyone turned to see an exuberant redhead approaching quickly, dressed in a colorful caftan and jewelry that shone brighter than the hotel's lighting. Beatrice? Elizabeth murmured, recognizing the event organizer, her temporary boss for the night. Sweetie, Beatrice arrived like a hurricane, hugging Elizabeth dramatically. Sorry for the delay, I was solving that situation with the ice sculpture. Everything's perfect now, thanks to your suggestions. Elizabeth looked at her without understanding anything, but Beatrice winked at her discreetly. Mrs. Blackstone. Beatrice turned to Eleanor with reverence. What an honor to have you here. And I see you've already met our dear Elizabeth, one of the brightest minds in luxury event planning. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Oh, yes. Discreet, talented, exclusive. She only works with the elite. You know how it is. That's probably why you haven't crossed paths before, Priscilla, dear. Elizabeth is very selective with her clients. Priscilla looked like she had bitten something bitter. Well, Eleanor said after a moment, what a delightful surprise. William, you really caught us off guard with this secret engagement. Too secret, Priscilla muttered, but was ignored. And when will the wedding be? Eleanor continued, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elizabeth and Will looked at each other in total panic. Soon, they said at the same time, then looked at each other again. Very soon, Will added. Extremely soon, Elizabeth confirmed, feeling like she was digging her own grave. How wonderful, Eleanor smiled. Then I expect to be invited to the ceremony. Of course, Elizabeth exclaimed, too loudly. It will be unforgettable. At that moment, the sound of a glass being tapped echoed through the ballroom, drawing everyone's attention to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, announced the master of ceremonies, it's time for the charity auction. Oh, what a shame, I must go, Eleanor said. But it was a pleasure meeting you, Elizabeth. I'm sure we'll see each other soon. She walked away majestically, followed by a still visibly upset Priscilla. As soon as they were out of sight, Elizabeth turned to Will, breathing heavily. 5 minutes, she panted. You said 5 minutes. And it was 5 minutes, he protested. The rest was overtime. Overtime? I just committed to marrying you. Technically, we committed to marrying each other. Elizabeth stared at him, incredulous. That doesn't reassure me one bit. Beatrice approached, still smiling. Honey, she said to Elizabeth, I don't know what game you're playing, but it was entertaining. Just be careful with Eleanor Blackstone. She seems sweet, but she's sharp as a blade. Thanks for the help, Elizabeth sighed. I think. You're welcome. Now I need you to get back to work. We have thirsty guests. Beatrice walked away, leaving Will and Elizabeth alone again. So, Will cleared his throat. About the $10,000. Oh no, Elizabeth interrupted him. Now the price has gone up. Gone up? Drastically. You got me into a much bigger mess than 5 minutes of acting. Will ran his hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling. Look, I know it got complicated, but... Complicated? Elizabeth almost shouted, then controlled herself and lowered her voice. Your grandmother expects to be invited to our non-existent wedding. We can figure this out. How? Well, we could pretend we broke up. Elizabeth looked at him as if he had suggested they fly to the moon. After 5 minutes of engagement, your grandmother will think you're completely unstable. She already thinks that, Will muttered. For good reason, apparently. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the guests head toward the auction. Listen, Will said finally. What if I increase the offer? To how much? 50,000? Elizabeth almost choked again. For what exactly? For you to keep being my fiancé, temporarily. Just until I figure out how to get out of this without Grandma Eleanor deciding that Priscilla is my only salvation. Elizabeth studied him. There was something more to this story, she was sure. Why are you so afraid of marrying Priscilla? She's beautiful, rich, clearly from your social class. And has the personality of a viper, Will completed. Besides, it's complicated. Complicated how? Will hesitated. She's my ex-girlfriend. She broke up with me to marry an English earl. Now that she's widowed, she's decided she wants me back. Ah. The pieces began to fall into place. And your grandmother approves. My grandmother thinks it would be a perfect match, he made air quotes. Two traditional families uniting, expanding business, all that talk. Elizabeth bit her lip, thinking. $50,000. It was more money than she would earn in 2 years working as a waitress. And what exactly do you expect me to do? Be my fiancé for a few weeks, show up at some events, convince my family that we're a couple in love, and then we can pretend it ended amicably. A few weeks? Elizabeth repeated. And I'm supposedly going to do this while working as a waitress? About that. Will looked uncomfortable. You kind of can't work as a waitress anymore. Why not? Because now you're officially my fiancé, and my family will investigate every aspect of your life. Elizabeth felt a wave of panic. They'll find out everything. That I live in a studio apartment, that I barely have money to pay bills. That's why I'll take care of everything, Will interrupted her. Apartment, clothes, everything you need to play the part. And after? After you keep everything and go back to your normal life, just with $50,000 more in your account. Elizabeth remained silent, processing the offer. It was insane. Completely insane. She barely knew this man and was considering pretending to be his fiancé for weeks. On the other hand, $50,000, and the chance to live like a rich person for a few weeks. I must be crazy, she muttered. Is that a yes? Elizabeth looked into his eyes. There was sincerity there, underneath all the desperation. And something else. Something that made her stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness. All right, she said finally. But with some conditions. Which ones? First, I want a contract in writing, with all the rules clear. Done. Second, if this gets out of control and I end up getting hurt somehow, you compensate me double. $100,000. Agreed. And third, she hesitated, then forced herself to continue. Nothing, you know. This is strictly professional. Will smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. Miss Delacroix, you have my word as a gentleman. They shook hands, and Elizabeth felt that electric current again. This was going to be more complicated than she imagined. So, she said, trying to sound confident, when do we start? Actually, Will looked around the ballroom. We already have. Half the people here have already seen us together. Tomorrow, news of my mysterious engagement will be in all the society columns in the city. Elizabeth followed his gaze and noticed that, indeed, several guests were watching them discreetly. Great, she sighed. And now? Now, Will offered his arm. How about you accompany me to the auction? After all, a good fiancée should support her fiancé's charitable causes. Elizabeth looked at the offered arm, then at his face. For an insane moment, she forgot this was just a financial agreement. The way he looked at her, it was as if she were truly special. Just to be clear, she said, accepting his arm, I know nothing about charity auctions. You don't need to. Just smile and accept when I win something for you. You're going to win something for me? Of course, that's what boyfriends do, isn't it? As they walked toward the main ballroom, Elizabeth couldn't help but think that, however insane it was, this night had become the most exciting of her life. And deep down, a stubborn little voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, $50,000 wouldn't be the only thing she'd gain from this agreement. But that was too dangerous an idea to entertain, for now. Lot number 15. A romantic weekend in the Hamptons, complete with private yacht and champagne dinner under the stars. Elizabeth gripped Will's arm tighter as the auctioneer's voice boomed through the ballroom. She had never been to an auction before, let alone one where people casually bid amounts that could buy a small house. Bidding starts at $5,000. This is insane, she whispered to Will, watching elegantly dressed women raise their paddles like they were swatting flies. $5,000 for a weekend? Wait until you see what comes next. Will murmured back, his breath tickling her ear in a way that sent shivers down her spine. Do I hear 6,000? 6,000 from the lady in blue. Elizabeth turned to see who the lady in blue was and froze. Priscilla Worthington Ashford held her paddle high, but her cold eyes were fixed directly on Will. 7,000, called out a man near the front. 8, Priscilla countered without hesitation, still staring at Will with a predatory smile. She's bidding on everything, Elizabeth observed nervously. Is that normal? For Priscilla, she's making a statement. Will's jaw tightened. She wants everyone to know she has unlimited resources. 10,000! Priscilla's voice cut through the room like a blade. The auctioneer looked around hopefully. Do I hear 11? Silence fell over the room. Priscilla's smile widened triumphantly. Going once, going twice. 15,000. Will's voice rang out clearly. Elizabeth's eyes widened as every head in the room turned toward them. She felt like she was in a spotlight, and judging by the whispers that immediately erupted, she was. Will, she hissed, what are you doing? Playing the part, he whispered back. A man in love would bid on a romantic weekend for his fiancée, wouldn't he? Priscilla's face had gone from triumph to fury in record time. Her paddle shot up again. 20,000. The gasps were audible now. Elizabeth felt dizzy. They were casually throwing around more money than she'd seen in years. 25, Will countered smoothly, as if he were ordering coffee. This is crazy, Elizabeth breathed. It's just a weekend. It's not about the weekend, Will explained quietly, never taking his eyes off Priscilla. It's about winning. 30,000. Priscilla's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Eleanor Blackstone appeared beside them, her eyes gleaming with interest. My, William. Such passion for charity. Just supporting a good cause, Grandma, Will replied, but Elizabeth noticed the slight tremor in his voice. 35, Will called out. 40, Priscilla shot back immediately. The crowd was eating this up. Elizabeth could see phones discreetly appearing, society mavens capturing what was clearly becoming the scandal of the evening. Will, Elizabeth tugged at his sleeve. Everyone's staring. Let them stare, he said firmly. 45,000. Eleanor leaned closer to Elizabeth. Tell me, dear, are you enjoying your first charity auction? Elizabeth's throat went dry. How was she supposed to know this was her first? It's very exciting. Indeed, William seems quite determined to win that lot for you. How romantic. 50,000. Priscilla's voice carried a note of desperation now. Elizabeth watched in horror as Will reached for his paddle again. $50,000 for a weekend she'd probably be too nervous to enjoy. It was madness. Will, don't, she whispered urgently. It's not worth it. He looked down at her, and something in her expression made him pause. His hand slowly lowered. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold to the lady in pink. The room erupted in polite applause, but Elizabeth could feel the undercurrent of disappointed gossip. They'd all been expecting Will to keep fighting. Priscilla's victorious smile could have powered half of Manhattan. Interesting, Eleanor murmured. Fiscal responsibility. I approve. Elizabeth wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Next lot, the auctioneer announced, a vintage 1947 Chateau d'Yquem, donated by the Pemberton family. Oh, that's lovely, Eleanor said approvingly. Richard always had excellent taste in wine. Elizabeth had no idea who Richard was, but she nodded as if she completely agreed. Bidding starts at $2,000. This time, Will didn't even lift his paddle. Elizabeth was relieved until she noticed Eleanor's sharp look. Not a wine enthusiast? Eleanor inquired. Elizabeth prefers champagne, Will said quickly. Don't you, darling? Oh, yes, Elizabeth agreed, hoping that was the right answer. Champagne is bubbly. Eleanor's eyebrow arched slightly, but she said nothing. The wine went for $8,000 to a distinguished gentleman Elizabeth didn't recognize. And now, the auctioneer's voice rose dramatically, our final lot of the evening, a custom diamond necklace designed by Cartier, featuring a rare pink diamond centerpiece. The crowd murmured appreciatively as the necklace was displayed. Even Elizabeth, who knew nothing about jewelry, could see it was breathtaking. Bidding starts at $25,000. 30, came a voice immediately. 35. 40. Elizabeth watched, fascinated despite herself as the bids climbed rapidly. 60,000 from the gentleman in the front. 70, Priscilla again, her paddle waving like a battle flag. Eleanor glanced meaningfully at Will. That would look lovely on a young bride. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. The pressure was back. 80,000. 90. The bidding was now between Priscilla and an elderly man Elizabeth didn't recognize. 100,000, Priscilla declared, her voice ringing with confidence. Silence fell. $100,000 for a necklace. Elizabeth couldn't even comprehend that amount. Do I hear 110? The auctioneer asked hopefully. The elderly man shook his head and lowered his paddle. Eleanor's gaze fixed on Will with laser intensity. The message was clear. A real fiancé would bid on that necklace. Will's hand moved toward his paddle. Going once. Elizabeth made a split-second decision. She grabbed Will's wrist, stopping him. Don't, she whispered urgently. Please. But, going twice. I don't need it, she said firmly, looking directly into his eyes. I don't want you to spend that kind of money on me. Something shifted in Will's expression. Surprise, then something warmer. Sold to the lady in pink. Priscilla's triumphant laugh carried across the room. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. How unusual. Elizabeth values substance over flash, Will said, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration that surprised them both. How refreshing, Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the evening's drama, Priscilla glided over to them, the Cartier necklace glittering around her throat. What a lovely evening, she purred. Though I must say, William, you seemed rather restrained in your bidding. I prefer to choose my battles, Will replied evenly. Wise? Priscilla smiled coldly. After all, some things are worth fighting for, and others, her gaze raked over Elizabeth dismissively, are merely temporary diversions. Elizabeth felt her temper flare. Temporary diversions can sometimes become permanent fixtures, she replied sweetly, while expensive jewelry can always be misplaced. Priscilla's smile faltered. Ladies, Eleanor intervened smoothly, perhaps we should continue this delightful conversation over dinner. Elizabeth, you simply must join us tomorrow night. Family dinner, you understand? Elizabeth's heart sank. Family dinner meant more scrutiny, more chances to slip up. We'd love to, Will answered for both of them. Wonderful, Eleanor beamed. 7 o'clock, don't be late. As Eleanor swept away, Priscilla leaned closer to Elizabeth. Enjoy it while it lasts, she whispered so only Elizabeth could hear. William always comes back to where he belongs. With that, she glided away, leaving Elizabeth staring after her. Well, Will said, offering his arm again. That went better than expected. Better? Elizabeth turned to him incredulously. Your ex-girlfriend basically declared war on me. Your grandmother clearly thinks I'm unsuitable, and now I have to survive a family dinner where I'll probably be grilled like a criminal. But you handled Priscilla brilliantly, Will grinned, and you stopped me from making two very expensive mistakes tonight. Why did you listen to me? Elizabeth asked, as they walked toward the exit. You could have won both auctions easily. Will was quiet for a moment. Because, he said finally, you were right. It wasn't worth it. And, he hesitated. No one's ever tried to stop me from spending money before. Everyone usually encourages it. Elizabeth studied his profile. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Well, she said lightly, someone has to keep you from bankrupting yourself on charity auctions. Is that your job now? For $50,000? Absolutely. Will laughed, a genuine sound that made several passing socialites turn to stare. Elizabeth realized with a start that she liked making him laugh. This was dangerous territory. So, she said, trying to refocus, tell me about this family dinner. What am I walking into? The usual, Will said cheerfully. Grandma Eleanor, my parents, probably my sister Charlotte if she's in town, and whatever eligible bachelors Grandma has invited to coincidentally drop by. Eligible bachelors? She hasn't given up on the idea that this engagement is fake, Will explained. Tomorrow night will be a test. Elizabeth stopped walking. What kind of test? Will's grin was slightly wicked. The kind where we need to be very convincing about being madly in love. Elizabeth stared at him, the full reality of what she'd gotten herself into finally hitting home. She was going to have to pretend to be madly in love with William Blackstone. The problem was, she was beginning to suspect it might not require as much pretending as she'd originally thought. And that scared her more than facing Eleanor Blackstone ever could. Elizabeth stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her new Madison Avenue apartment, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The elegant black cocktail dress hugged her curves perfectly, the designer heels added 3 inches to her height, and the subtle makeup made her look like she belonged in Vogue. She looked exactly like the kind of woman who would date William Blackstone. She also looked terrified. You can do this, she whispered to herself. It's just dinner. How hard can it be? Her phone buzzed with a text from Will. Outside. You look beautiful, I'm sure. Elizabeth grabbed her clutch, another expensive prop in this elaborate charade, and headed downstairs. When she stepped outside, Will was leaning against a sleek black Tesla, looking devastatingly handsome in a navy suit. His face lit up when he saw her, and for a moment his expression was so genuine it made her heart skip. Wow, he breathed. You look like someone who belongs at your family dinner? She asked nervously. Like someone who's going to give my grandmother a heart attack, he grinned, opening the passenger door for her. In the best way possible. As they drove through Manhattan's evening traffic, Elizabeth tried to calm her racing pulse. Okay, brief me, she said. What do I need to know about your family? Dad's Robert. He'll probably interrogate you about your business. Mom's Victoria. She'll want to know about your family background. My sister Charlotte is unpredictable. And your grandmother? We'll try to catch you in contradictions all evening. Will glanced at her. Just remember our story. We met at the charity planning meeting 3 months ago. Love at first sight. Whirlwind romance. Right. Elizabeth nodded, trying to memorize details that felt increasingly flimsy. And we're getting married when? Soon. Vaguely soon. That's not very specific. Specific gets us in trouble. Vague gives us room to maneuver. Elizabeth wasn't convinced, but before she could argue, they were pulling up to an impressive townhouse on the Upper East Side. Warm light spilled from every window, and she could see elegant figures moving around inside. Showtime, Will murmured, coming around to help her out of the car. The door was answered by a distinguished man who was clearly Will's father. Same strong jawline, same piercing eyes, but with silver at his temples. "William," Robert Blackstone's voice boomed. "And this must be the mysterious Elizabeth we've heard so much about." "Mr. Blackstone," Elizabeth extended her hand gracefully. "Thank you for having me." "Please, call me Robert," he said, but his handshake lingered a moment too long, as if he were taking her measure. Come in. Victoria's been dying to meet you." The townhouse was everything Elizabeth had expected. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's cars. But it was also warm and lived in, with family photos scattered on side tables and a golden retriever that immediately bounded over to investigate the newcomers. "Down Gatsby," Will laughed, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Elizabeth, meet the family troublemaker." "He's beautiful," Elizabeth said, genuinely delighted as Gatsby sniffed her hand, then promptly decided she was acceptable. "He likes you," observed a warm voice. Elizabeth looked up to see an elegant woman with Will's eyes and a kind smile. "I'm Victoria. Dogs are excellent judges of character." "Elizabeth Delacroix," she replied, accepting Victoria's embrace. "Your home is lovely." "Thank you, dear. William's told us so much about you." "No, he hasn't," Elizabeth thought, but smiled anyway. "Elizabeth." Eleanor's imperious voice cut through the moment. "How wonderful that you could join us." Eleanor swept into the room wearing an emerald green dress and enough diamonds to blind a small aircraft. She looked Elizabeth up and down with the precision of a military inspection. "That's a lovely dress," Eleanor observed. "Chanel?" Elizabeth's mind went blank. She had no idea what designer had created the dress Will's stylist had selected. "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "it's Valentino. I can spot their evening wear from across the room." Everyone turned to see a stunning brunette entering the room, wearing jeans, a cashmere sweater, and a mischievous smile. "Charlotte." Will hugged his sister warmly. "I thought you were in London." "Flew in this morning. Couldn't miss meeting the woman who finally tamed my wild brother." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with humor as she extended her hand to Elizabeth. "Charlotte Blackstone, and I am dying to hear how you two really met." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "Really met? Oh, come on," Charlotte grinned. "The official story is so romantic it sounds like a fairy tale. I want the embarrassing details. Did he spill something on you? Trip over his own feet? Please tell me he did something mortifying." "Charlotte," Victoria chided, but she was smiling too. "Actually," Elizabeth said, thinking quickly, "he saved me from a very aggressive waiter who was about to drop an entire tray of champagne on my dress." Will shot her a grateful look. It wasn't entirely untrue. He had steadied her when she'd backed into the dessert table. "How gallant," Eleanor said dryly. "And this was at a charity planning meeting?" "The preliminary walkthrough," Elizabeth elaborated, warming to her story. "I was checking the flow of the room when this waiter came barreling around the corner. And I caught both the tray and the beautiful woman." Will jumped in smoothly, "though I think the tray was easier to handle." "Oh, that's terrible," Charlotte laughed. "Elizabeth, please tell me you made him pay for that line." "I did consider dumping the champagne on him myself," Elizabeth admitted with a grin. The family laughed, and Elizabeth felt some of her tension ease. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. "Dinner is served," announced a uniformed staff member. The dining room was as impressive as the rest of the house, with a mahogany table that could seat 12 and china that looked like museum pieces. Elizabeth found herself seated between Will and Charlotte, directly across from Eleanor's eagle-eyed gaze. "So, Elizabeth," Robert said as the first course was served, "William mentioned you're in event planning. Tell us about your business." Elizabeth's mouth went dry. She took a sip of wine to buy time. "I specialize in exclusive events," she said carefully. "Very high-end, very private." "Sounds mysterious," Charlotte said with interest. "What kind of events?" "Private parties, corporate retreats, intimate celebrations. All technically true if you considered serving at these events as being involved in them." "How fascinating." Eleanor interjected. And where did you study event planning? Elizabeth's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Study? She'd never studied anything beyond high school, unless you counted the online bartending course she'd taken last year. I'm mostly self-taught, she said finally. I believe you learn more from experience than from textbooks. How practical? Eleanor's tone suggested this was not necessarily a compliment. I admire that, Victoria said warmly. There's something to be said for learning through doing. Absolutely, Charlotte agreed. Some of the most successful people I know never set foot in a classroom for their careers. Elizabeth smiled gratefully at them both. And your family? Robert asked. Are they in New York? Elizabeth's chest tightened. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. She'd been alone ever since, working whatever jobs she could find to survive. My parents passed away several years ago, she said quietly. The table fell silent. Victoria reached over and squeezed her hand. I'm so sorry, dear, she said softly. Thank you. Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. It's been difficult, but Will has helped me feel less alone. She looked at him as she said it, and was surprised to see genuine concern in his eyes. He reached over and covered her hand with his. We have each other now, he said simply. The moment felt so real that Elizabeth almost forgot they were acting. How did you propose? Charlotte asked suddenly, clearly trying to lighten the mood. Will and Elizabeth looked at each other in panic. It was, Will began. Private, Elizabeth finished quickly. Very private. Oh, come on, Charlotte pressed. Not even a hint? He was romantic, Elizabeth said firmly. That's all you're getting. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. How refreshingly discreet. The conversation moved on to safer topics. Charlotte's work in London, Robert's golf game, Victoria's latest charity project. Elizabeth managed to navigate most of it without major disasters, though she did accidentally reveal she'd never been to the Hamptons when Victoria mentioned their summer house. Never? Charlotte looked astonished. But it's only 2 hours away. I've been busy, Elizabeth said weakly. Well, that settles it, Victoria declared. You simply must come with us next weekend. The whole family goes out for the last weekend of the season. Elizabeth's eyes widened in panic, but Will squeezed her hand reassuringly. We'd love to, he said smoothly. After dinner, Eleanor cornered Elizabeth in the powder room. You're not what I expected, she said without preamble. Elizabeth's heart hammered. I hope that's not a bad thing. I haven't decided yet. Eleanor studied her reflection in the mirror as she reapplied her lipstick. My grandson has never brought a woman home before. Never. Oh, we've met his girlfriends at parties, galas, the usual social functions. But never here, never for family dinner. Eleanor's eyes met Elizabeth's in the mirror. This house is sacred to William. He would only bring someone here if they truly mattered. Elizabeth felt like she might be sick. Mrs. Blackstone, call me Eleanor. We're family now, aren't we? The older woman turned to face her directly. I just want you to know that if you hurt him, I will destroy you. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. But, Eleanor continued, her voice softening slightly, if you love him, really love him, then you have my blessing. He deserves to be happy. Before Elizabeth could respond, Eleanor swept out of the room, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts. When they finally left the townhouse 2 hours later, Elizabeth felt like she'd run a marathon. That went well, Will said as they got back in the car. Well? Elizabeth turned to him incredulously. Your grandmother threatened to destroy me. She threatens to destroy everyone I date, Will said dismissively. It means she likes you. That was her liking me? Trust me, you passed the test. Elizabeth wasn't so sure. As they drove back through the city, she couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's words. He would only bring someone here if they truly mattered. The problem was, Elizabeth was starting to matter to Will. and he was starting to matter to her. This fake engagement was becoming dangerously real. "Please tell me you know how to sail," Will said, pulling into the circular driveway of what could only be described as a mansion pretending to be a beach house. Elizabeth stared through the windshield at the sprawling white structure with wraparound porches, dormers that looked like sleepy eyes, and enough windows to supply a small hotel. Beyond it, she could see the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "Define sail," she said weakly. "Oh no. I mean, I've seen boats on TV." Will dropped his head onto the steering wheel. "My family has been sailing since before the Mayflower. It's practically in our DNA." "Well, it's definitely not in mine." Elizabeth unbuckled her seatbelt, trying to project more confidence than she felt. How hard can it be? Famous last words, she realized, when 30 minutes later, she found herself clutching the side of a yacht that was larger than her entire apartment building. Watching Will and his father efficiently adjust sails she couldn't even pronounce the names of. "Just hold that line steady," Robert called out cheerfully, as if Elizabeth had any idea which line he meant. She grabbed the nearest rope and held on for dear life as the boat tilted at what felt like a 45-degree angle. "We're going to die," she shrieked. "We're just tacking." Charlotte laughed from where she was perched casually on the side rail like this was a Sunday stroll. "You should see us in a real wind." "This isn't real wind?" Elizabeth's voice came out as a squeak. Will appeared beside her, his hair tousled by the salt breeze, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of a sailing magazine. "Hey," he said softly, covering her white-knuckled hands with his own. "You're okay. I've got you." Something in his voice made her look up at him. His eyes were warm, reassuring, and for a moment the terror receded. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted quietly. "That's okay." He smiled. "I'll teach you." He positioned himself behind her, his arms coming around to guide her hands on the rope. Elizabeth tried to focus on his instructions about wind direction and sail trim, but all she could think about was how solid and warm he felt against her back, and how his voice rumbled in his chest when he spoke close to her ear. "Feel that?" he murmured. "The boat responding to the wind?" Elizabeth felt a lot of things, none of which had anything to do with sailing. "There," Victoria called from the bow. "Perfect, Elizabeth, you're a natural." Elizabeth looked around in surprise. The boat was gliding smoothly through the water now, the sails full and steady. She had actually helped make that happen. "See?" Will's breath tickled her ear. "You just needed to trust yourself." When she turned to smile at him, she found his face much closer than expected. For a heartbeat, they stayed frozen like that, the wind whipping around them, the boat cutting through the waves, and something electric crackling in the space between them. "William!" Eleanor's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Come help your father with the mainsail." Will stepped back quickly, and Elizabeth immediately missed his warmth. The rest of the sailing expedition passed without major disasters, though Elizabeth did manage to get soaked when an unexpected wave crashed over the bow, causing Charlotte to collapse in giggles and Eleanor to purse her lips in disapproval. "At least you're enthusiastic," Robert said kindly as they headed back to shore, Elizabeth wringing seawater out of her hair. That evening, the family gathered on the expansive deck for what Victoria called a casual barbecue, but which looked like something out of a magazine spread. Twinkling lights were strung overhead, candles flickered in hurricane glasses, and the smell of grilled lobster filled the warm evening air. Elizabeth had changed into a sundress that the mysterious stylist had included in her new wardrobe, and she actually felt almost relaxed for the first time since this whole charade began. "So," Charlotte said, settling beside Elizabeth on the porch swing with a glass of wine, "what's my brother like when you two are alone?" "Charlotte," Will warned from across the deck where he was helping his father tend the grill. "What? I'm just curious." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with mischief. "He's been different since he met you." "Different how?" Elizabeth asked, genuinely curious. "Happier, more real, I guess. He's always been the perfect son, you know? Perfect grades, perfect job, perfect everything. But with you, he seems more like himself." Elizabeth's chest tightened. Charlotte was describing exactly what she'd noticed too. but it was based on a lie. "He's pretty wonderful," she said quietly, and realized she meant it. "Uh-oh," Charlotte grinned. "You've got it bad." Before Elizabeth could deny it, a commotion erupted from the beach below. A sleek speedboat was pulling up to the private dock, and Elizabeth's heart sank as she recognized the figure stepping off. "Priscilla," Will muttered, appearing at Elizabeth's side. "What the hell is she doing here?" "Language, William," Eleanor chided, but she looked pleased. Priscilla glided up the beach stairs like she owned the place, wearing a flowing white dress that probably cost more than Elizabeth's rent for a year. Her blonde hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and she looked like a goddamn magazine ad. "Surprise," she called out brightly. "I was just passing by and thought I'd stop in." "Passing by from where?" Charlotte asked dryly. "The middle of the ocean?" "Oh, Charlotte, always so amusing." Priscilla air-kissed Will's sister before turning her megawatt smile on the group. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just family time," Will said coolly. But Elizabeth noticed he'd moved closer to her almost protectively. "How lovely." Priscilla's gaze landed on Elizabeth with the precision of a laser-guided missile. "Elizabeth, what a interesting choice of dress for a beach evening." Elizabeth looked down at her sundress, which had seemed perfectly appropriate 5 minutes ago, but now felt shabby next to Priscilla's designer perfection. "I like to be comfortable," Elizabeth replied evenly. "Of course you do," Priscilla smiled sweetly. "Comfort is so important, isn't it?" "Priscilla," Robert intervened diplomatically, "you're welcome to join us for dinner." "How generous. I'd love to." And just like that, their intimate family evening became a battlefield. Priscilla inserted herself into every conversation, reminiscing about shared memories with Will, mentioning mutual friends Elizabeth had never heard of, and generally making it clear that she belonged in this world in a way Elizabeth never could. "Remember that summer in Santorini, William?" Priscilla sighed wistfully during dinner. "Just the two of us, sailing around the Greek islands." "That was a long time ago," Will said stiffly. "Not that long." Priscilla's smile was predatory. "Some memories are worth preserving, don't you think?" Elizabeth felt sick. She could see Eleanor nodding approvingly, clearly thinking that Priscilla was a much more suitable match than the event planner who didn't know port from starboard. "Elizabeth," Victoria said kindly, "would you help me clear the dishes?" In the kitchen, Victoria studied Elizabeth's face with maternal concern. "Don't let her get to you," she said gently. "Priscilla has always been territorial." "She and Will have a lot of history," Elizabeth said, trying to sound casual while her heart was breaking a little. "History, yes, but that's all it is." Victoria touched Elizabeth's arm. "I've never seen William look at anyone the way he looks at you." "How does he look at me?" "Like he can't quite believe you're real." Victoria smiled. "Like he's afraid if he blinks, you'll disappear." Elizabeth's throat tightened. If only Victoria knew how accurate that was. When they returned to the deck, they found Priscilla regaling everyone with a story about a charity gala in Monaco, complete with mentions of princes and celebrities Elizabeth had only seen on magazine covers. And then Prince Alessandro said the most amusing thing. Priscilla's laughter tinkled like wind chimes. Elizabeth sat back down next to Will, feeling like an imposter at her own fake engagement. "You okay?" Will murmured quietly. "Perfect," she lied. As if sensing her discomfort, Gatsby chose that moment to wander over and plop his golden head directly in Elizabeth's lap, looking up at her with adoring eyes. "Gatsby certainly has taken a shine to you," Robert observed with amusement. "He usually ignores strangers." "He's very intelligent," Eleanor added, and Elizabeth couldn't tell if that was meant as a compliment or an observation. "Dogs can sense things about people," Priscilla said with false sweetness, "though sometimes they're drawn to the simpler souls." The insult was delivered so smoothly that for a moment, Elizabeth wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. But the slight intake of breath from Charlotte confirmed it. "Funny." Will's voice was dangerously quiet. "I've always thought Gatsby had excellent taste." The tension on the deck was suddenly thick enough to cut with a knife. "Of course," Priscilla backtracked quickly. I just meant that animals appreciate authenticity. Yes, Charlotte said icily, they really do. The rest of the evening passed in stilted conversation, with Priscilla dropping increasingly pointed comments about Elizabeth's refreshing simplicity and charming naivety. By the time she finally departed in her speedboat, Elizabeth felt like she'd been flayed alive. Later, as the family dispersed to their rooms, Will found Elizabeth standing alone on the beach, staring out at the dark ocean. I'm sorry about tonight, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Priscilla was way out of line. She wasn't wrong, Elizabeth said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. I don't belong here, Will. I don't know about sailing or Monaco or any of this world you live in. So what? Will turned to face her. You think any of that matters? It matters to your family. It matters to people like Priscilla. Priscilla doesn't matter, Will said fiercely. And my family. They like you, Elizabeth, really like you. Even Grandma Eleanor, though she'd never admit it. They like who they think I am, Elizabeth corrected sadly. But I'm not really that person. Will was quiet for a long moment, the moonlight reflecting off the water between them. Maybe not, he said finally. But maybe that person is who you could be. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart aching with the impossibility of it all. What if I don't want to be anyone else? She whispered. What if I just want to be enough as I am? Will stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes even in the darkness. You are enough, he said softly. You're more than enough. For a moment, standing there on the beach with the waves lapping at their feet and the salt air surrounding them, Elizabeth almost believed him. Almost believed that this could be real. But fairy tales didn't happen to girls like her. Did they? Elizabeth woke to the sound of seagulls and the gentle crash of waves against the shore. For a blissful moment she forgot where she was and why she was there. Then reality crashed over her like a cold wave. She was in the Hamptons, in Will's family's guest room, pretending to be engaged to a man she was falling for despite every rational thought in her head. A soft knock on her door made her sit up in the enormous four-poster bed. Elizabeth, are you awake? It was Charlotte's voice. Come in, Elizabeth called, quickly running her fingers through her tangled hair. Charlotte entered carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee and wearing a conspiratorial grin that immediately made Elizabeth nervous. Emergency caffeine delivery, Charlotte announced, settling cross-legged on the bed like they were college roommates. And I come bearing gossip. Gossip? About last night's drama. Charlotte's eyes sparkled. Priscilla called Will this morning. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. She did? At 6 a.m. Apparently she had some urgent matter to discuss about their shared investments. Charlotte made air quotes, rolling her eyes. Can you believe the audacity? What did Will say? Elizabeth tried to sound casual, while her heart hammered. That's the beautiful part. He told her he was busy planning wedding details with his fiancée and hung up. Charlotte grinned triumphantly. Then he threw his phone in the drawer and said, and I quote, "Some people need to learn when to let go." Elizabeth felt a flutter of something dangerously close to hope. He's really committed to this whole act, she said carefully. Act? Charlotte tilted her head. Elizabeth, you do realize my brother is crazy about you, right? It's complicated. No, it's not. Charlotte set down her mug and fixed Elizabeth with a serious look. Will has dated plenty of women. Beautiful women, accomplished women, women who looked perfect on paper. But I've never seen him fight for someone the way he fought for you last night. Before Elizabeth could process that statement, another knock interrupted them. Elizabeth, dear? Victoria's voice called. Breakfast is ready. Charlotte winked. Saved by Mom. But this conversation isn't over. Downstairs, the family was gathered around a massive farmhouse table laden with enough food to feed a small army. Fresh fruit, pastries, eggs Benedict, and what appeared to be homemade everything. Good morning, Sleeping Beauty. Will smiled as she entered, and Elizabeth's heart did that stupid fluttering thing again. He looked unfairly handsome in a casual white button-down and khakis, his hair still slightly mussed from sleep. "Sorry I'm late," Elizabeth said, sliding into the chair beside him. "I'm not used to vacation schedules." "No need to apologize," Robert said warmly. "We're on island time here." Eleanor, resplendent in a silk blouse at 8 in the morning, studied Elizabeth over her reading glasses. "How did you sleep, dear? I hope the ocean sounds weren't too disturbing for someone from the city." "Actually, I found them peaceful," Elizabeth replied honestly. "Much better than sirens and car horns." "Ah, yes." Eleanor's smile was razor sharp. "You mentioned you live in Manhattan. Which neighborhood?" Elizabeth's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her tiny studio was technically in Manhattan, but barely. "The Upper West Side," she said, which was true if you stretched the definition of upper to include her less than desirable block. "How lovely," Eleanor continued smoothly. "Near the museum district?" "Not exactly." Will's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. "Elizabeth values authenticity over location," he said firmly. "She chose her apartment for the character, not the address." "Character," Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. "How refreshing." Elizabeth was beginning to hate that word. "I think it's wonderful," Victoria interjected. "Too many young people today only care about having the right zip code. There's something to be said for choosing substance over status." "Exactly," Charlotte agreed, shooting Eleanor a pointed look. "Remember when Will lived in that terrible apartment during college? You called it character building." "That was different," Eleanor said primly. "William was learning independence." "And maybe Elizabeth learned the same lesson," Charlotte countered. The table fell into awkward silence until Robert cleared his throat. "So, what's everyone's plan for today? The weather's perfect for the beach." "Actually," Eleanor said, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, "I was hoping Elizabeth might join me for a little shopping expedition in East Hampton. Just us girls." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. One-on-one time with Eleanor Blackstone sounded like a death sentence. "That's very kind," she stammered, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Eleanor's smile could have cut glass. "I insist. It will give us a chance to get better acquainted." Will's grip on her hand tightened. "Actually, Elizabeth and I were planning to—" "We're planning to what, dear?" Eleanor's gaze shifted to her grandson. "Spend the entire weekend attached at the hip? Surely you can spare your fiancé for a few hours." "Checkmate," Elizabeth forced a smile. "I'd love to go shopping with you, Eleanor." 2 hours later, Elizabeth found herself in the passenger seat of Eleanor's pristine Mercedes, heading toward what Eleanor cheerfully described as just a few little boutiques. The first little boutique turned out to be a designer store where the cheapest item cost more than Elizabeth's monthly rent. "Now then," Eleanor said, settling into a plush chair while a sales associate brought champagne, "let's find you something suitable for the Weatherby's anniversary party next weekend." The Weatherby's? Elizabeth's mind raced. Another social event meant another opportunity to humiliate herself. "Old family friends," Eleanor explained airily. "Very traditional, very discerning. First impressions are so important, don't you think?" Elizabeth nodded numbly as the sales associate began pulling dresses that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Try this one," Eleanor commanded, holding up a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than Elizabeth's car. In the dressing room, Elizabeth stared at her reflection. The dress was beautiful, elegant, sophisticated, perfectly tailored. She looked like someone who belonged at a Weatherby anniversary party. She also looked like someone she didn't recognize. "Well?" Eleanor's voice called from outside. Elizabeth emerged, reluctantly. Eleanor studied her with the intensity of an art critic examining a questionable painting. "Better," she pronounced finally, "though something's missing." She turned to the associate. "Jewelry, I think, and perhaps something for her hair." 20 minutes later, Elizabeth was draped in diamonds and pearls, her hair swept into an elegant chignon, transformed into someone who could grace the cover of Town and Country. Perfect, Eleanor declared with satisfaction. This is exactly what William needs by his side. Elizabeth stared at herself in the three-way mirror. The woman looking back at her was everything Priscilla had accused her of not being: polished, refined, appropriate. She hated it. I can't accept all this, Elizabeth protested weakly. Of course you can. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. Consider it a gift from family. At the next store, Eleanor continued her makeover mission with military precision. Shoes, handbags, even underwear that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Now, Eleanor said as they sat in a cafe afterward, surrounded by enough shopping bags to stock a small boutique. Let's discuss your future. Elizabeth's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. My future? Your future with William, Eleanor clarified, though her eyes suggested she wasn't convinced there was one. Marriage is more than romance, dear. It's about compatibility, shared values, common goals. Will and I share the same values, Elizabeth said carefully. Do you? Eleanor's smile was deceptively pleasant. Tell me, what are your thoughts on children? Children? Elizabeth nearly choked. William has always wanted a large family. At least 3 children, perhaps 4. Of course, that would mean significant changes to any career aspirations you might have. Elizabeth felt trapped. Any answer she gave could be used against her later. Will and I haven't discussed specific numbers, she said finally. Ah. Eleanor made a note in her mental file. And what about holidays? The family has very strong traditions. Christmas in Aspen, summers here in the Hamptons, Easter at the Palm Beach house. Each word felt like a cage door closing. Eleanor was painting a picture of a life so far removed from anything Elizabeth had ever known that it might as well have been on another planet. That sounds lovely, Elizabeth managed. It is lovely, Eleanor agreed. For the right person. Someone who understands the responsibilities that come with the Blackstone name. The charity boards, the social obligations, the constant scrutiny. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You see, dear, when you marry William, you're not just marrying a man. You're marrying a family, a legacy, a way of life that has existed for generations. Some people find that overwhelming. Elizabeth met Eleanor's gaze steadily, understanding the challenge for what it was. Some people, she said quietly, are stronger than they appear. For the first time since Elizabeth had met her, Eleanor's smile seemed genuinely pleased. Indeed they are, she murmured. Indeed they are. On the drive back to the house, Eleanor was unusually quiet, occasionally glancing at Elizabeth with an expression that was impossible to read. Eleanor? Elizabeth ventured as they pulled into the driveway. Yes, dear. Thank you. For today, I mean. For everything. Eleanor turned off the engine and studied Elizabeth for a long moment. Don't thank me yet, she said finally. The real test is still coming. As they walked toward the house, arms laden with shopping bags, Elizabeth caught sight of Will through the window. He was laughing at something Charlotte had said, his face relaxed and genuinely happy. In that moment, Elizabeth realized something that terrified her more than all of Eleanor's tests combined. She was falling in love with him. Really, truly, completely falling in love. And in 2 weeks, when this charade ended, she was going to have to walk away from the best thing that had ever happened to her. The thought made her physically ill. Elizabeth? Eleanor's voice brought her back to the present. Are you all right? You look pale. Just tired, Elizabeth lied. It's been a long day. Indeed it has, Eleanor agreed, but her eyes suggested she wasn't buying the excuse. As they entered the house, Will immediately appeared, his face lighting up when he saw her. There are my 2 favorite women, he grinned, taking some of the bags from Elizabeth's arms. How was the shopping expedition? Educational, Eleanor said with a meaningful look at Elizabeth. Very educational indeed. Will looked between them suspiciously, but before he could ask questions, Charlotte bounded down the stairs. "Oh my God, you two bought out half the Hamptons," she exclaimed, eyeing the bags. "Please tell me there's something scandalous in there." "Just the essentials," Eleanor said primly. Elizabeth needed a few things for upcoming events. As the family gathered around to see the purchases, Elizabeth felt like she was watching her life from outside her body. Here she was, being fussed over by Will's family, wearing clothes that cost more than she used to make in a month, pretending to belong to a world that would never truly accept someone like her. The worst part was how right it felt when Will's arm slipped around her waist. How natural it seemed when he pressed a kiss to her temple. "You okay?" he murmured in her ear. "Grandma didn't torture you too badly, did she?" Elizabeth looked up at him, at his concerned blue eyes, his gentle smile, the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and felt her heart break a little more. "She was wonderful," Elizabeth lied. "We had a great time." But even as she said it, Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. The real test is still coming. Elizabeth had a sinking feeling she was right. Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror in her Madison Avenue apartment, barely recognizing herself. The black cocktail dress Eleanor had chosen fit like it was made for her. The diamonds at her throat caught the light perfectly, and her hair was swept into the kind of elegant updo she'd only seen in magazines. She looked exactly like the woman William Blackstone should marry. She felt like a fraud. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "It's just one party. How bad can it be?" Her phone buzzed with a text from Will. "Ready for tonight? You're going to be amazing." Elizabeth's heart did that fluttering thing it always did when he texted. Over the past week, their fake relationship had developed an unsettling authenticity. Will brought her coffee in the mornings, called just to hear her voice, and looked at her like she hung the moon. It was becoming harder to remember this was all pretend. Another text arrived. "Picking you up in 10. Can't wait to show you off." Elizabeth's stomach twisted with guilt. He was so proud to have her on his arm, and he had no idea she was about to embarrass him in front of New York's social elite. When Will arrived, looking devastating in his black tuxedo, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "Wow," he breathed, taking her hands and spinning her slowly. "Elizabeth, you look like someone who belongs at the Weatherbys?" she asked hopefully. "Like someone who belongs with me," he said softly, and the sincerity in his voice made her chest ache. The Weatherby mansion on Fifth Avenue was a testament to old New York money. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars, marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, and artwork that belonged in museums lined the walls. Elizabeth felt like she was walking into a museum herself. "Remember," Will murmured as they approached the receiving line. "Harold Weatherby made his fortune in shipping. Margaret is obsessed with orchids, and they've been married 45 years today." "Shipping, orchids, 45 years," Elizabeth repeated like a mantra. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackstone." Harold Weatherby, a distinguished man with kind eyes, approached them with open arms. "And this must be the mysterious fiancé we've heard so much about." "Harold, Margaret." Will smiled warmly. "I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Delacroix." Margaret Weatherby, an elegant woman with silver hair and the bearing of royalty, clasped Elizabeth's hands warmly. "My dear, you're even more beautiful than Eleanor described," she said kindly. "We're so delighted you could join us." "Thank you so much for including me," Elizabeth replied, genuinely touched by their warmth. "Congratulations on your anniversary. 45 years is incredible." "The secret," Harold winked, "is marrying your best friend." Elizabeth felt Will's hand tighten on hers, and when she looked up at him, something in his expression made her breath catch. "That's lovely advice," she managed. As they moved into the party, Elizabeth was surprised to find herself actually enjoying the evening. The Weatherbys had invited an eclectic mix of guests: artists, philanthropists, business leaders, and academics, and the conversations were genuinely interesting. She was discussing sustainable architecture with a fascinating woman named Dr. Sarah Chen when a familiar voice cut through the chatter. "Elizabeth, there you are." Elizabeth turned to find Priscilla bearing down on her like a perfectly dressed shark. wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Priscilla," Elizabeth replied evenly. "What a surprise." "I simply had to come over and compliment you on your dress," Priscilla gushed with false enthusiasm. "It's so different from what you usually wear." Dr. E. Chen excused herself tactfully, leaving Elizabeth alone with the predator. "Eleanor has such impeccable taste," Priscilla continued, circling Elizabeth like she was examining a specimen. "Though I have to ask, isn't it exhausting, constantly reinventing yourself?" "I'm sorry?" "Oh, come now." Priscilla's smile turned razor-sharp. "We both know this whole transformation is Eleanor's handiwork. The clothes, the jewelry, even the way you're carrying yourself tonight. It's all so carefully orchestrated." Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, darling. I'm stating a fact." Priscilla leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You're playing dress-up in someone else's life, and everyone can see it." Before Elizabeth could respond, Will appeared at her side, his arm sliding protectively around her waist. "Ladies," he said pleasantly, though his eyes were ice-cold as they fixed on Priscilla. "Am I interrupting something?" "Not at all." Priscilla's demeanor shifted instantly to sugary sweetness. "I was just telling Elizabeth how lovely she looks tonight. So, put together." "She's always beautiful," Will replied firmly. "Inside and out." Priscilla's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Of course, Will, I should mingle. Enjoy the party." As she glided away, Elizabeth felt her composure cracking. "I need some air," she whispered. Will guided her through the crowd to a quiet balcony overlooking Central Park. The cool night air was a relief after the stifling atmosphere inside. "Don't let her get to you," Will said gently, turning to face her. "Priscilla's just jealous." "Is she wrong, though?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible. "About the dress-up, I mean." Will was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the moonlight. "Do you feel like you're playing dress-up?" he asked finally. Elizabeth looked down at her elegant dress, touched the diamonds at her throat. "Sometimes. Tonight, especially." "Then take it off." "What?" Elizabeth's eyes widened. Will grinned, shrugging out of his tuxedo jacket. "Not the dress, the jewelry, the fancy stuff. Be yourself." "Will, we're at the Weatherbees." "So?" He was already reaching up to unclasp her necklace, his fingers gentle at the nape of her neck. "These people want to meet the woman I'm marrying, not some perfect socialite prototype." As he removed the diamond earrings, Elizabeth felt like she could breathe again. "Better?" he asked, stepping back to study her. Elizabeth nodded, surprised to find that she actually did feel better. Lighter somehow. "Good." Will smiled. "Because that's the woman I fell for, the one who stopped me from making an ass of myself at a charity auction, who's terrified of sailing but tried anyway, who made my dog fall in love with her in 5 minutes." "Will," Elizabeth's heart was hammering. "The woman," he continued, stepping closer, "who makes me want to be a better man just by being herself." He was so close now that Elizabeth could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, could smell his cologne mixed with something that was uniquely him. "You're not playing dress-up, Elizabeth," he said softly. "You're just learning that you deserve beautiful things, including being loved exactly as you are." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Will," she whispered, "I need to tell you something." "There you are." They sprang apart as Charlotte burst through the balcony doors, slightly breathless and wearing a concerned expression. "Thank God," she panted. "Eleanor's been looking for you both. Apparently the Weatherbees want to make a toast to young love, and they specifically requested you two." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. A public toast meant public attention, which meant more opportunities to say the wrong thing. "We'll be right in," Will said, but his eyes never left Elizabeth's face. "What did you want to tell me?" "Later," Elizabeth said quietly, though she wondered if she'd ever have the courage to finish that sentence. Back inside, Harold Weatherby was indeed calling for attention, champagne glass raised high. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Margaret and I have been blessed with 45 years of marriage, and we've learned that the secret to lasting love is quite simple. Marry someone who makes you laugh, who challenges you to be better, and who you choose again every single day." The crowd murmured appreciatively. "Tonight we're honored to celebrate not just our anniversary, but the engagement of two young people who clearly embody that same spirit, William Blackstone and Elizabeth Delacroix." Applause erupted, and Elizabeth felt every eye in the room turn toward them. Will's arm tightened around her waist, anchoring her. "To William and Elizabeth," Harold continued, "may your love story be as enduring and joyful as ours has been." "To William and Elizabeth," the room chorused, glasses raised high. Elizabeth managed a smile and a gracious nod, but inside she was screaming. Here were 200 of New York's most prominent citizens toasting her fake engagement, wishing her well on a marriage that would never happen. As the crowd dispersed and conversations resumed, Eleanor materialized beside them like a perfectly dressed specter. "Well done," she said quietly to Elizabeth. "You handled that beautifully." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, though the praise felt hollow. "The Weatherbys are quite taken with you," Eleanor continued. "Margaret specifically mentioned how refreshing it is to meet a young woman with substance." Elizabeth nodded mutely. "Of course," Eleanor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Substance requires authenticity. And authenticity, my dear, requires honesty." The words felt like a warning, but before Elizabeth could respond, Margaret Weatherby appeared, clasping Elizabeth's hands warmly. "My dear, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you remind me so much of myself at your age," she said kindly. "I was terrified when Harold first brought me to events like this. I was a teacher from Queens, and suddenly I was expected to make small talk with millionaires." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "You were?" "Oh yes," Margaret laughed. "I felt like such an imposter. But Harold's mother, a formidable woman not unlike our Eleanor here, took me under her wing. She taught me that grace isn't about where you come from. It's about how you treat others and stay true to yourself." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "That's beautiful advice. The point is," Margaret squeezed her hands gently, "you belong here because William loves you. Everything else is just window dressing." As Margaret walked away, Elizabeth felt the weight of her deception settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Here was this wonderful woman, offering wisdom and acceptance based on a complete lie. "You okay?" Will asked quietly, noticing her distress. "I'm fine," she lied, "just overwhelmed by everyone's kindness." But as they made their way through the remainder of the party, accepting congratulations and well wishes from dozens of well-meaning strangers, Elizabeth felt like she was drowning in her own deception. These people genuinely cared about Will's happiness. They were investing emotionally in a relationship that was doomed to end in heartbreak. By the time they left the party, Elizabeth felt physically ill with guilt. "That went perfectly," Will said happily as they rode home in the car. "You were amazing tonight." "Was I?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Are you kidding? The Weatherbys adore you. Half the women there asked me how I got so lucky, and even Priscilla looked defeated." "Good," Elizabeth managed, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. When they reached her apartment, Will walked her to the door, as always, but instead of the usual quick goodnight kiss on the cheek, he lingered. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "what you started to tell me earlier, on the balcony, what was it?" Elizabeth looked up at him, at his hopeful expression, at the genuine care in his eyes, and felt her heart shatter. "Nothing important," she whispered. "Just thank you. For tonight. For everything." Will studied her face for a long moment as if he could read the truth written there. "Any time," he said finally, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sweet dreams." As Elizabeth watched him drive away, she leaned against her door and finally let the tears fall. In 2 weeks, their fake engagement would end, and she would have to walk away from the most wonderful man she'd ever known. The problem was, she was no longer sure she could do it. And she was even less sure he would let her. Elizabeth stared at the contract spread across her coffee table, the black ink seeming to mock her in the morning sunlight. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks left of this beautiful lie, and then she would walk away from Will with $50,000 and a broken heart. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd never felt poorer. Her phone rang, jarring her from her melancholy. Will's name flashed on the screen, accompanied by a photo of him laughing that she'd taken last weekend at the farmer's market, back when she could still pretend this was all just business. "Good morning, beautiful." His voice was warm honey through the phone. "How are you feeling after last night's social marathon?" "Like I survived a very elegant war," Elizabeth replied, trying to match his light tone. "You did more than survive. You conquered. I'm pretty sure Margaret Weatherby wants to adopt you." Elizabeth's chest tightened with guilt. She was lovely. She was right, though, about you belonging here. There was something different in Will's voice, something deeper. "Elizabeth, we need to talk. Can I come over?" Her heart hammered. "Talk about what?" "About us. About how I'm feeling. About what this all means." Elizabeth closed her eyes, panic flooding her system. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Will was going to tell her he loved her, and she was going to have to figure out whether to keep lying or break both their hearts with the truth. "Of course," she heard herself say. "Come over." 30 minutes later, Will was standing in her tiny apartment, looking impossibly handsome in jeans and a navy sweater, and completely out of place among her thrift store furniture and discount decorations. "This place is so you," he said softly, taking in the eclectic mix of books, plants, and artwork she'd collected over the years. "It's not much," Elizabeth said defensively. "It's real," Will corrected, settling beside her on the second-hand couch. "It's honest, like you." Elizabeth's stomach churned with irony. "Will, let me go first," he interrupted, taking her hands in his. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since last night. About us, about how this all started, about where we're going." Elizabeth's mouth went dry. "Okay. When I first asked you to be my fake fiancé, I thought I knew exactly what I was doing. It was a business arrangement, a temporary solution to a temporary problem." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "But somewhere along the way it stopped being fake for me." Elizabeth's heart shattered and soared simultaneously. "Will, I'm in love with you, Elizabeth," he said simply, his blue eyes holding hers with devastating honesty. "Not with the idea of you, not with the woman my family wants me to marry, but with you. The real you. The woman who argues with me about spending too much money, who gets seasick on yachts but tries anyway, who makes terrible coffee but brings it to me every morning anyway." Tears blurred Elizabeth's vision. "You love my terrible coffee?" "I love everything about you," he laughed softly. "Even the things that drive me crazy. Especially the things that drive me crazy." He stood suddenly, pacing to the window and back, running his hands through his hair. "I know this complicates everything," he continued. "I know we had an agreement, a timeline, an exit strategy. But Elizabeth, I can't let you walk away. Not now. Not when I've finally found the person I want to spend my life with." Elizabeth felt like she was drowning in her own deception. Here was this incredible man, laying his heart bare, and it was all based on a lie she'd helped create. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying forget the contract, forget the timeline, forget everything except this." He dropped to one knee beside the couch, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Elizabeth's world stopped spinning. "This isn't fake anymore," Will said, opening the box to reveal a stunning vintage ring, simple and elegant and perfect. "Elizabeth Delacroix, will you marry me? For real this time?" The ring was beautiful, but not as beautiful as the hope and love shining in Will's eyes. Elizabeth stared at him. At this moment she'd dreamed about and dreaded, and felt her carefully constructed world crumble. "Will," she choked out, "I can't." His face fell. Why not? I thought you felt the same way. I do, she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. God, Will, I love you so much it terrifies me. But I can't marry you. I don't understand. He was still kneeling, still holding the ring, confusion and hurt warring on his face. Elizabeth stood abruptly, putting distance between them before she lost her courage entirely. Because it's all been a lie, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Not my feelings, those are real, but everything else. I'm not who you think I am. What do you mean? I mean my name isn't Elizabeth Delacroix, it's Elizabeth Johnson. I'm not a sophisticated event planner. I'm a waitress who was working the charity auction the night we met. I don't live on the Upper West Side. I live here, in this tiny studio, and I pay rent by working whatever jobs I can find. Will slowly rose to his feet, the ring box closing with a soft snap. Elizabeth, I don't know anything about sailing or wine or charity galas, she continued desperately. I've never been to the Hamptons before last weekend. I learned table manners from YouTube videos. The clothes, the apartment you set me up with, the knowledge about your world, it's all fake. The silence that followed was deafening. Will stood frozen, processing her words, his face cycling through disbelief, understanding, and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. So when you said you worked in hospitality, he said slowly, I served drinks at parties like the one where we met. And the event planning consultation? I was a waitress, working for Beatrice's catering company. Will sat down heavily on her couch, the ring box disappearing back into his pocket. How much? He asked quietly. What? How much was I paying you to pretend to love me? Elizabeth felt like he'd slapped her. Will, it wasn't like that. 50,000, wasn't it? His voice was devoid of emotion. $50,000 to make me believe someone could actually love me for who I am, not what I have. That's not... Elizabeth knelt in front of him, desperate to make him understand. Yes, you paid me, but my feelings aren't fake. What happened between us, what I feel for you, that's real. Will looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his eyes were cold. Is it? Or are you just a better actress than I gave you credit for? The words hit like physical blows. Elizabeth rocked back on her heels, devastated. How can you say that? Because everything I know about you is a lie. Will stood abruptly, pacing like a caged animal. Your name, your job, your background. If you could lie about all of that, why should I believe anything else you've told me? Because I'm telling you the truth now, Elizabeth cried, desperation making her voice crack. I know I should have told you sooner, I know I should have been honest from the beginning, but I was scared. Scared of what? Of this, she gestured between them, of losing you, of you realizing that someone like me could never actually fit into your world. Someone like you? Will repeated flatly. You mean someone who lies for money? Elizabeth flinched as if he'd struck her. That's not fair. Isn't it? Will's laugh was bitter. You literally took money to pretend to be someone you're not. How is that not lying for money? Because I fell in love with you, Elizabeth shouted, her composure finally cracking completely. Because what started as a job became the most real thing I've ever experienced. Because for the first time in my life I felt like I mattered to someone. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she pressed on. I know I handled this all wrong. I know I should have told you the truth weeks ago. But Will, every day with your family, every moment we spent together, every time you looked at me like I was something precious, it was real for me. My feelings were never part of the act. Will stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight with emotion. But the person I fell in love with doesn't exist, does she? He said finally. Elizabeth Delacroix, sophisticated event planner, confident socialite. She was just a character you created. No, Elizabeth whispered. She was who I could be with you, who I wanted to be. Built on lies. Built on hope, she corrected desperately. Will, please. I know I screwed this up beyond belief, but don't let my mistakes ruin what we have. What we have is based on deception, Elizabeth. How am I supposed to trust anything about us now? Elizabeth felt her heart breaking into irreparable pieces. Because you know me. The real me. You've seen me at my most vulnerable, my most honest. You've seen me scared and brave and stubborn and caring. That's not fake, that's who I am. Will was quiet for a long time, staring out her window at the city beyond. I need time, he said finally. I need to think about all of this. Will, please. He looked at her and the pain in his eyes nearly brought her to her knees. I need space to figure out what was real and what wasn't. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I think the woman I fell in love with is exactly who you are. But I don't know if I can forgive you for not trusting me enough to let me find that out for myself. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Elizabeth alone with the wreckage of her confession. She sank to the floor, finally allowing herself to sob for what she'd lost. Not just the money or the luxurious lifestyle, but the love of the most extraordinary man she'd ever known. Outside her window, the city buzzed with life and possibility. But inside her tiny apartment, Elizabeth felt like her world had ended. She'd told him the truth, just like she'd promised herself she would. She just hadn't expected the truth to hurt this much. 3 days. It had been 3 agonizing days since Will walked out of Elizabeth's apartment, and she felt like she was slowly dying from the inside out. She'd called in sick to all her temp jobs, survived on coffee and stubborn hope, and worn a hole in her carpet from pacing. She was staring at her phone for the 100th time, debating whether to text him, when someone knocked on her door. Elizabeth's heart leaped. Maybe it was Will. Maybe he'd forgiven her. Maybe... Elizabeth, open up. It's Charlotte. Elizabeth's heart sank, but she opened the door to find Will's sister standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and a determined expression. You look terrible, Charlotte said without preamble, pushing past Elizabeth into the apartment. Thanks. That's exactly what every girl wants to hear. Good, because I'm not here to coddle you. Charlotte set the coffees down and turned to face her with arms crossed. I'm here because my brother is driving everyone insane. What do you mean? Elizabeth asked, trying to sound casual while her heart hammered. I mean he's been holed up in his office for 3 days, snapping at everyone, throwing himself into work like a madman, and generally acting like someone ripped his heart out and stomped on it. Elizabeth winced. Charlotte, which according to my sources, is exactly what happened. Your sources. Charlotte's eyes gleamed. Eleanor told me everything. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. Everything? About the fake engagement, the contract, the whole elaborate charade. Charlotte settled onto the couch with her coffee. Honestly, I'm impressed. You had us all completely fooled. I never meant to hurt anyone, Elizabeth said quietly, sinking into the chair across from her. Oh, I know that, Charlotte waved dismissively. Anyone with eyes could see you were head over heels for Will. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? He hates me. He doesn't hate you, you idiot. He's hurt and confused and probably scared out of his mind, but he doesn't hate you. Elizabeth looked at her skeptically. How can you be so sure? Because I know my brother. When Will hates someone, he cuts them out completely. No drama, no emotion, just gone. But he's not cutting you out, he's agonizing over you. There's a difference. A painful difference, Elizabeth muttered. The best kind. Charlotte grinned. Look, I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but if you love him, really love him, you need to fight for him. I told him the truth. I put myself out there completely. What more can I do? You can stop wallowing in self-pity and start proving that Elizabeth Johnson is just as worthy of love as Elizabeth Delacroix ever was. Before Elizabeth could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Eleanor Blackstone herself, looking every inch the imperious matriarch in a perfectly tailored coat and pearls. Mrs. Blackstone, Elizabeth scrambled to her feet. What are you doing here? May I come in? Eleanor's tone was unreadable. Elizabeth nodded mutely, stepping aside. Eleanor swept into the small apartment, taking in the modest furnishings with sharp eyes. Cozy, she observed, though whether it was meant as an insult or compliment was unclear. "Eleanor," Charlotte said carefully, "maybe this isn't the best time." "Nonsense. This is exactly the right time." Eleanor fixed Elizabeth with her penetrating stare. "Sit down, dear. We have much to discuss." Elizabeth perched nervously on the edge of her chair, feeling like she was facing a firing squad. "I suppose you think I'm here to berate you for deceiving my family," Eleanor began. "Aren't you?" "Quite the opposite. I'm here to thank you." Elizabeth blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My grandson has been sleepwalking through life for years," Eleanor continued calmly. "Perfect grades, perfect job, perfect girlfriends who bored him to tears. He was becoming exactly what society expected him to be, and losing himself in the process. I don't understand." "You woke him up," Eleanor said simply. For the first time in his adult life, William was excited about something. Happy, passionate, real. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "But I lied to him." "To all of you." "Yes, you did. And it was wrong." Eleanor's voice was matter of fact. "But your reasons, those I understand." "You do?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "I was 19 when I met William's grandfather. I was a secretary at his company, completely out of his social league. When he first asked me to dinner, I was so terrified of embarrassing him that I spent my entire paycheck on a dress and took etiquette lessons." Elizabeth stared at her. "You did?" "I was so afraid he would realize I didn't belong that I nearly lost the best thing that ever happened to me." Eleanor's eyes grew distant. "The difference is, Charles saw through my act immediately and called me on it. He told me he'd fallen in love with the woman who argued with him about workers' rights, not the one trying to impress him with perfect table manners. What happened? I married him 6 months later, and we had 53 wonderful years together." Eleanor leaned forward. "The point, my dear, is that love isn't about deserving someone. It's about choosing them, again and again, despite their flaws." "But Will doesn't want to choose me anymore," Elizabeth whispered. "Doesn't he?" Eleanor's smile was enigmatic. "Tell me, what do you know about the Blackstone Foundation's new scholarship program?" Elizabeth frowned at the apparent change of subject. "Nothing. Why?" "It's a program William has been developing for weeks now. Full scholarships for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to attend college, with mentorship and job placement services included." "That sounds wonderful, but—" "It's being funded entirely by his personal trust fund," Eleanor continued. "Millions of dollars, Elizabeth, and do you know what he's calling it?" Elizabeth shook her head. "The Elizabeth Initiative." The room went silent. Elizabeth felt like all the air had been sucked from her lungs. What?" "He named a scholarship program after you," Charlotte said softly. "A program designed to help people like you, people who deserve opportunities but don't have the right connections or backgrounds to get them." "But that was before he knew the truth about me," Elizabeth protested. "No," Eleanor corrected. "He finalized the paperwork yesterday. After your confession." Elizabeth's mind reeled. "I don't understand." "My grandson is many things, but he's not stupid," Eleanor said dryly. "He's had time to think, to process what you told him. And apparently he's decided that your background doesn't change who you are. It explains why you're so extraordinary." "Then why hasn't he called? Why hasn't he—" "Because he's proud," Charlotte interrupted, "and hurt, and probably scared that you'll reject him now that you don't need his money." "That's ridiculous," Elizabeth said immediately. "I love him. Money has nothing to do with it." "Then prove it," Eleanor said simply. "How?" Eleanor stood, smoothing her coat with practiced elegance. "The foundation is announcing the Elizabeth Initiative tonight at the Metropolitan Museum. It's a private reception, very exclusive, very important to William personally." "I'm sure it is, but—" "You should be there." Elizabeth stared at her. "I wasn't invited. I'm inviting you now." Eleanor's smile was razor sharp. "William needs to see that you're willing to fight for him, not just apologize to him. Mrs. Blackstone, I can't just crash a museum reception. You're not crashing, you're attending as my personal guest. Eleanor headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and Elizabeth? Wear something that makes you feel like yourself, not like who you think we want you to be. After Eleanor left, Charlotte turned to Elizabeth with excitement dancing in her eyes. Do you know what this means? She asked. That your grandmother has lost her mind. That she likes you. Eleanor Blackstone doesn't help people she doesn't approve of. If she's giving you a chance to win Will back, it's because she thinks you deserve him. Elizabeth felt a flutter of hope, quickly squashed by reality. What if he doesn't want me there? What if seeing me just makes everything worse? Then you'll know you tried everything, Charlotte said firmly. But Elizabeth, what if you don't go? What if you let pride and fear keep you from the love of your life? Elizabeth looked around her tiny apartment, at the life she'd built for herself, modest but honest. Then she thought about Will, about the scholarship program he'd named after her, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could fight for their love and win. I'll need a dress, she said finally. Charlotte grinned. I know just the place. 4 hours later, Elizabeth stood in front of her mirror wearing a simple navy dress she'd found at a consignment shop. Elegant, but not trying too hard. Expensive looking, but not obviously so. She'd done her own hair and makeup, choosing to look like the best version of herself rather than someone else entirely. She looked like Elizabeth Johnson pretending to be Elizabeth Delacroix. She looked like exactly who she was. Ready? Charlotte asked, appearing in the doorway with car keys. No, Elizabeth admitted, but I'm going anyway. That's the spirit. Now let's go get your man back. As they drove through the city toward the museum, Elizabeth's nerves threatened to overwhelm her. She had no idea what she was going to say to Will, no grand gesture planned, no perfect words prepared. All she had was the truth, that she loved him, that she was sorry, and that she was willing to fight for them if he was willing to forgive her. It would have to be enough. Because walking away wasn't an option anymore, not when she'd finally found the person worth fighting for. The Metropolitan Museum loomed ahead, its steps crowded with elegantly dressed guests. Elizabeth took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to either win back the love of her life or lose him forever. Either way, she wasn't going down without a fight.